The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory was a place where desperate men made desperate choices. When drought claimed 3 consecutive harvests and creditors circled like vultures, Samuel Whitmore faced the unthinkable, his own daughter standing on an auction block, her freedom the price of his failures. But in that crowd of leering faces and greedy eyes, one man stood different, tall, proud, with the bearing of a warrior and eyes that held both fury and compassion. He would change everything with a single, thunderous bid that echoed across the plains and into legend. This is the story of how honor transcended hatred, how love conquered prejudice, and how 2 souls from opposite worlds found their destiny intertwined beneath the endless Dakota sky. It's a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that form when humanity triumphs over the darkness that men create. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore ranch, but there was no beauty in the light for Samuel Whitmore. He stood on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, watching the dust clouds on the horizon that meant only one thing: the creditors were coming. His calloused hands gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white, and the weight of 3 years of failed harvests pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain. Behind him, through the thin walls, he could hear his daughter Margaret moving about in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared what might be their last breakfast in this house. At 19, she had her mother's gentle spirit and golden hair, but she also possessed a strength that reminded Samuel of the frontier women who had carved civilization from the wilderness. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know that her father had already signed papers that would change her life forever. The drought had been merciless. 3 summers without enough rain to fill a teacup, and the cattle had either died or been sold for far less than they were worth. The wheat fields had turned to dust, and the creek that once ran clear and strong now held only cracked mud and the bones of fish. Samuel had borrowed against everything. The land, the house, even the future he had planned for his daughter. Now those debts had come due, and he had nothing left to give except the one thing he had sworn to protect with his life. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She had noticed the tension in her father's shoulders, the way he stared at the horizon like a man watching for war. "Papa, breakfast is ready," she said softly, but her green eyes were troubled. "Who's coming down the road?" Samuel couldn't meet her gaze. How could he tell her that Mr. Jameson from the bank was arriving with papers that would make her an indentured servant? How could he explain that the law allowed a man's debts to be paid through the labor of his children, and that she would be auctioned to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock? The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. "Business, Maggie," he finally managed, using the pet name he had called her since she was small. "Just business." But Margaret wasn't fooled. She had seen the worry lines deepen around her father's eyes over the past months, had noticed how he barely touched his food, and spent long hours staring at papers he thought she couldn't see. She had overheard fragments of conversations with neighbors, hushed words about debts and auctions that made her stomach twist with dread. The riders drew closer, and Samuel could make out Jameson's black coat and the star on the sheriff's chest. Behind them came a small crowd of men from town, some curious, others with the calculating look of buyers at market. His heart broke a little more with each hoofbeat that brought them nearer to his door. Margaret stepped beside her father, and he felt her small hand slip into his large, work-roughened one. "Whatever it is, Papa, we'll face it together," she said with a conviction that made his chest ache. She had no idea what she was saying, no understanding of what the next few hours would bring. Jameson dismounted first, his expensive boots hitting the dust with authority. He was a thin man with sharp features and eyes like chips of ice, the kind of man who foreclosed on farms and slept soundly afterward. The sheriff, Tom Bradley, looked uncomfortable, but determined to do his duty. The other men spread out in a semicircle, some leaning against the fence posts, others standing with their hands in their pockets, all of them watching Margaret with an intensity that made Samuel's blood boil. "Samuel Whitmore," Jameson called out, his voice carrying across the yard like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You know why we're here." Samuel squeezed his daughter's hand once and then released it, stepping forward to face the men who held their fate. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked between her father and the assembled men, confusion and fear beginning to dawn in her eyes. She had heard stories of debt auctions, terrible tales told in whispers around kitchen tables, but surely that couldn't be what was happening here. Surely her father wouldn't have let things go that far. Jameson pulled a rolled document from his coat and unfolded it with practiced efficiency. "Margaret Whitmore," He read in a voice devoid of emotion, age 19, unmarried, able-bodied, is hereby placed under bond of indenture to satisfy the debts of Samuel Whitmore in the amount of $847 plus accumulated interest and fees. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She staggered backward, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Papa," she whispered, but Samuel couldn't look at her. The shame was too great, the weight of his failure too heavy to bear. "The terms are 5 years of service," Jameson continued, as if reading a grocery list. "The highest bidder will assume responsibility for room, board, and reasonable clothing in exchange for labor as determined appropriate. The auction will commence immediately." Margaret found her voice then, and it came out as a cry that seemed to echo across the empty plains. "No! Papa, tell them no!" She grabbed her father's arm, shaking him, demanding that he fight for her, protect her as he always had. But Samuel just stood there, broken and defeated, unable to meet her desperate gaze. The first bid came from Harlan Potts, who owned the saloon in town. He was a fat man with greasy hair and hands that wandered where they shouldn't, and his bid of $200 was accompanied by a leer that made Margaret's skin crawl. Other bids followed quickly. The blacksmith offered $250. The hotel owner went to $300. Margaret looked around at the faces of men she had known all her life, men who had smiled at her in church and tipped their hats on the street, now calculating her worth like they were buying a horse. The betrayal was almost more than she could bear. These were neighbors, people she had trusted, and now they were bidding on her freedom as if she were property. The bidding climbed slowly, each increase driving the knife of humiliation deeper into Margaret's heart. $400 from the grain merchant, $450 from the minister who ran the orphanage, $500 from old man Carlyle, who already worked 3 indentured servants on his farm. Margaret realized with growing horror that she was going to spend the next 5 years of her life as a slave in all but name, owned by one of these men who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. Samuel finally found the courage to look at his daughter, and what he saw there nearly brought him to his knees. Her face was pale as winter snow, her hands trembling, but her eyes burned with a fury he had never seen before. She was looking at him with such disappointment and betrayal that he felt something inside him crumble to dust. "How could you?" she whispered, and those 3 words carried more pain than any scream could have conveyed. Before Samuel could answer, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted the auction. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching from the west, moving at a steady pace that spoke of confidence rather than urgency. As he drew closer, Margaret could see that he was tall and dark-skinned, with long black hair that moved in the wind and clothes that marked him clearly as Lakota. The atmosphere in the yard changed instantly. Hands moved to gun belts, and the casual chatter died away to nervous silence. This was Dakota Territory in 1876, and relations between the white settlers and the native tribes were tense at best, violent at worst. The man's presence here, at this moment, was both unexpected and unwelcome. He rode straight into the center of the gathering, his horse, a magnificent paint stallion, stepping proudly as if it knew it carried someone important. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, and Margaret found herself staring at him despite the chaos of her situation. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something about him that commanded attention, a quiet dignity that made the other men seem small and grasping by comparison. "What's this gathering about?" he asked in clear English, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority that made several men shift uncomfortably. Jameson puffed up like an angry rooster. "This is none of your concern, Indian. This is legal business between white folks." The man's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "I am Joseph Standing Bear," he said, and Margaret noticed that several of the older men recognized the name and looked even more nervous. "I trade with many of the ranchers in this territory." "What kind of business requires so many men to watch one girl?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as his gaze settled on her briefly. There was something in his eyes, not the calculating hunger she saw in the other men, but something else. Concern, perhaps, or recognition of her distress. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, clearly wanting to defuse the situation before it escalated. "It's a dead auction, Standing Bear. Legal and proper. The girl's father owes money, and she's being indentured to pay it off. Nothing to concern yourself with." Joseph Standing Bear's face went very still, and Margaret saw his hands clench into fists. "You auction human beings like cattle? It's not slavery," Jameson said defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's legal indenture," Temporary servitude to satisfy debt. Perfectly legal under territorial law. Standing Bear's gaze moved from face to face, taking in the assembled bidders with obvious disgust. When his eyes met Margaret's again, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Fury on her behalf, as if her suffering mattered to this stranger who owed her nothing. "What is the debt?" Standing Bear asked quietly. $847 plus interest and fees, Jameson replied, clearly irritated by the questions. "Are you here to bid or not? Because if not, you need to move along and let us conduct our business." Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Margaret's face. She found herself unable to look away, caught by the intensity in his dark eyes. There was something happening here that she didn't understand, some communication passing between them that transcended words. Finally, Standing Bear spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, $1,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret felt her heart stop beating as every man in the yard turned to stare at the Lakota warrior who had just bid enough money to buy a small ranch. Jameson's mouth fell open, and even the sheriff looked stunned. "You don't have that kind of money," Potts sputtered, his face red with indignation. Standing Bear reached into his shirt and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. He poured a handful into his palm, and the metal gleamed in the morning sun. "I have money," he said simply. "The question is whether you will accept it." Margaret stared at him in amazement and growing confusion. Why would this stranger, this man from a tribe that was supposed to be her people's enemy, pay such a sum for her freedom? What did he want from her that could possibly be worth so much? Jameson looked around at the other bidders, but none of them could match such an offer. The grain merchant shook his head and backed away, as did the hotel owner and the others. Even Carlyle, the wealthiest man present beside Standing Bear, knew when he was beaten. "Going once," Jameson called out, his voice uncertain. This was clearly not how he had expected the day to unfold. "Going twice. Wait!" Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Every eye turned to her as she stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly, despite the tears on her cheeks. "I want to know why. Why would you pay so much for a stranger?" Standing Bear met her gaze directly, and when he spoke, his words were meant for her alone, though everyone could hear them. "Because no human being should be sold like an animal. Because what is happening here is wrong, no matter what your laws say. Because sometimes a warrior must stand against injustice, even when it is not his own people who suffer." The honesty in his voice, the simple dignity of his words, made Margaret's chest tight with emotion. Here was a man willing to spend a fortune to help someone he had never met, while her own neighbors bid on her like she was livestock. "Sold," Jameson declared, clearly eager to complete the transaction before anyone could change their mind. "Joseph Standing Bear, for $1,000. As Standing Bear counted out gold coins into Jameson's palm, Margaret realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. She was no longer an indentured servant, destined for years of drudgery and humiliation. But she was also no longer free, belonging now to a Lakota warrior whose motivations were as mysterious as they were generous. Samuel finally approached his daughter, reaching out as if to touch her face, but she stepped back, the hurt in her eyes stopping him cold. "Maggie, Don't," she said quietly. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. Sorry doesn't change what you did. Sorry doesn't give me back my life." Standing Bear finished his transaction with Jameson and turned to face Margaret. Up close, she could see the strength in his features, the intelligence in his dark eyes, and something else, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a warrior. "Come," he said simply, offering her his hand. "We should go." Margaret looked back at the house where she had grown up, at the father who had betrayed her, at the men who had been willing to buy her freedom. Then she looked at the hand extended toward her, strong, calloused from work and battle, but steady and somehow reassuring. She had no choice, really. Standing Bear now legally owned her labor for the next 5 years. But as she placed her small hand in his larger one, she realized that for the first time since the nightmare began, she didn't feel afraid. Uncertain, confused, angry, yes, but not afraid. As they walked toward his horse, Standing There spoke quietly so only she could hear. "I know you have questions. I know you are frightened and angry. These things I understand. But know this, I did not buy you to own you. I bought you to free you from those who would have used you badly." Margaret looked up at him, searching his face for deception, but found only sincerity. "Then why?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" Standing Bear helped her onto his horse before answering. When he swung up behind her, she could feel the solid warmth of his presence, strangely comforting despite everything. "What I want," he said as they rode away from the only home she had ever known, "is for you to remember what it feels like to be treated with dignity. When your time of service is complete, I want you to know that not all men are like those who would have owned you today." As the ranch disappeared behind them, Margaret closed her eyes and tried to understand what had just happened to her. She had been saved, but by whom? And what lay ahead in the territory of a man whose people and hers had been at war for generations? The questions swirled in her mind like dust in the wind, but for now, all she could do was hold on tight and trust that somehow, impossibly, the warrior who had bought her freedom might be the key to finding herself again. The ride to Standing Bear's territory took them through country that Margaret had never seen before, though she had lived her entire life in Dakota territory. They traveled west and then north, following game trails that seemed to appear and disappear at his will, moving through landscape that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile. The rolling grasslands gave way to hills dotted with stands of cottonwood and oak, and clear streams that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Margaret rode in silence for the first hour, her mind still reeling from the morning's events. Behind her, Standing Bear sat easily in the saddle, guiding his horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure that spoke of years of partnership between man and animal. She found herself acutely aware of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warm strength of his arms on either side of her as he held the reins, the way he seemed to move with the horse rather than simply riding it. When they stopped at a creek to water the horse and rest, Margaret finally found her voice. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, accepting the strip of dried meat he offered her. She was surprised to find that she was hungry despite everything that had happened. "To my home," Standing Bear replied, settling cross-legged on the grass beside the stream. "It is still several hours' ride from here." Margaret chewed the tough meat thoughtfully. It was seasoned with unfamiliar spices that made her mouth tingle pleasantly. What kind of home? A teepee? She realized as soon as the words left her mouth that they might sound insulting, but Standing Bear simply smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "when we travel or hunt. But my permanent home is a cabin I built near a lake, stone and timber, with windows and a real fireplace. My people have learned to take the best from both worlds." This surprised her. The stories she had heard about the Lakota painted them as nomadic savages who lived in hide tents and knew nothing of civilized life. Standing Bear seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "You expected something different," he said, not accusingly but with understanding. "Your people have many wrong ideas about mine, just as my people have wrong ideas about yours. Perhaps that is part of the problem between us." Margaret looked at him more carefully, noticing details she had missed in the chaos of the morning. His clothes were a mixture of traditional and white man's garments, leather leggings and shirt, but also a cotton vest and boots that looked like they had been made by a skilled cobbler. His hair was long and black, held back by a beaded band, but he was clean-shaven in the white style. He was a man caught between two worlds, she realized, making his own path through both. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Really, I mean. Why spend so much money on a stranger?" Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the flowing water. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful. 3 winters ago, my sister was captured by white soldiers during a raid on our winter camp. She was 15 years old, younger than you. They did not auction her or offer her protection of any law. They simply took her, and when we found her body 6 months later, he stopped, his jaw tightening with remembered pain. Margaret felt her breath catch. "I'm sorry," she whispered, meaning it. "When I saw you standing there, surrounded by men who looked at you like meat for sale, I saw my sister's face. I remembered my failure to protect her, and I knew I could not ride away and let the same thing happen to another young woman." The honesty in his voice, the raw pain he was willing to share with her, made Margaret see him differently. This wasn't charity or some strange cultural obligation. This was a man trying to heal his own wounds by preventing someone else's suffering. "What happened to your sister wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "Just like what happened to me wasn't mine." Standing Bear looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such understanding from someone who had every right to be bitter and frightened. "Perhaps," he said, "but knowing something in your mind and feeling it in your heart are different things." They rode on through the afternoon, and Margaret found herself paying attention to the world around her in ways she never had before. Standing Bear pointed out plants that could be used for medicine or food, showed her how to read the signs that told of passing animals, explained how the shape of clouds could predict weather changes. It was like seeing the land through new eyes, understanding it as a living thing rather than just empty space between towns. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, they crested a hill, and Margaret gasped at the sight spread out before them. A clear blue lake nestled in a valley, surrounded by hills, covered in tall grass and scattered groves of trees. Near the shore stood a substantial log cabin with a stone chimney, smoke rising from it into the evening air. Gardens and corrals were laid out around the building, and she could see horses grazing in fenced pastures. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking, and was rewarded by a genuine smile from Standing Bear. "My grandfather chose this spot," he said with obvious pride. He said the spirits of the lake would bring peace to anyone who lived here with respect for the land. As they rode down toward the cabin, Margaret noticed other details that surprised her. There were white-style outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, what looked like a workshop. The gardens were laid out in neat rows with plants she recognized and others that were foreign to her. It looked prosperous and well cared for, nothing like the primitive camp she had expected. A woman emerged from the cabin as they approached, and Margaret felt a moment of anxiety. She was clearly Lakota, perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided with colored ribbons and a dress that mixed traditional beadwork with practical cotton fabric. Her face was stern as she watched them approach, and Margaret wondered what she was thinking about this white woman her kinsman had brought home. "Grandmother," Standing Bear said as he dismounted, using the respectful term for an elder woman. "This is Margaret. She will be staying with us." The woman, he had called her grandmother, but Margaret could see they weren't related by blood, studied her with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "She is the one from the auction," she said, and Margaret realized that somehow word of the morning's events had already reached this place. "Yes," Standing Bear replied simply. "She needs a place to heal from what was done to her." The woman, who Standing Bear introduced as Mary Crow Feather, helped Margaret down from the horse with surprising gentleness. "You are welcome here, child," she said in accented but clear English. "But you must understand that this is not a white woman's world. If you stay, you must learn our ways and respect our customs." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. "I'll do my best," she said. "I don't really know what else to do." Mary Crow Feather's stern expression softened slightly. "Honest words," she said approvingly. "Come, you need food and rest. Tomorrow we can begin to sort out what comes next." The interior of the cabin surprised Margaret even more than the exterior had. It was spacious and well-appointed, with real glass windows, a large stone fireplace, and furniture that showed skilled craftsmanship. But it was also clearly Indian in its decoration and arrangement. Beautiful weavings hung on the walls, the floors were covered with thick rugs and geometric patterns, and the very air seemed to carry the scent of sage and sweetgrass. Mary Crowfeather showed her to a small room that contained a real bed with clean blankets, a wooden chest for belongings, and another window that looked out toward the lake. "This was meant for Standing Bear's wife when he chooses one," she explained. "But for now, it is yours." Margaret sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the day. "What am I supposed to do here?" she asked. "I mean, legally, he owns my labor for 5 years. But what does that mean in practice?" Mary Crowfeather settled into a chair near the window, her hands busy with some kind of beadwork. "What it means is whatever Standing Bear decides it means," she said. "But I have known that boy since he was small, and I know his heart. He will not ask more of you than you are willing to give." "But surely he expects something," Margaret pressed. "Men don't spend $1,000 without expecting something in return." The older woman was quiet for a moment, her needle flashing as she worked. "Standing Bear lost more than his sister 3 winters ago," she said finally. "He lost his faith in the goodness of people. He saved you not because he wanted something from you, but because he needed to prove to himself that there was still honor in the world." Margaret didn't know how to respond to that. She had been thinking of Standing Bear as her savior, but perhaps she was his salvation as much as he was hers. Over the following days, Margaret began to settle into a routine that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Standing Bear made it clear that she was not a servant or slave. She was expected to contribute to the household, but as a member of it rather than as property. Mary Crowfeather taught her to prepare traditional foods, to tend the gardens using Indian methods, to work with leather and beads in the long evenings by the fire. The work was hard but satisfying in ways that surprised her. At home, she had done women's work because it was expected. But here, every task seemed to have meaning and purpose beyond mere necessity. Mary Crow Feather explained the spiritual significance of the corn they tended, the reasons why certain plants were gathered at specific times, the stories behind the patterns they wove and beaded. Standing Bear himself proved to be a patient and thoughtful teacher. He showed her how to read the weather and the behavior of birds, how to move quietly through the forest, how to handle the horses with confidence rather than fear. He never spoke down to her or treated her like a child, and he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and observations. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Margaret found herself alone with Standing Bear, on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset over the lake. The peace of the place had begun to work its way into her soul, healing wounds she hadn't even realized were there. "Can I ask you something?" she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Of course," Standing Bear replied, his eyes still fixed on the water. "Mary Crow Feather said you lost your faith in people when your sister died. What did she mean?" Standing Bear was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Before Winter Moon was killed, I believed that all people, red and white, were capable of honor and decency. I thought the conflicts between our peoples came from misunderstanding rather than genuine evil. Her death taught me that some humans are no better than rabid wolves. They kill for the pleasure of it, not from necessity or even greed." Margaret felt her chest tighten at the anguish in his voice. "And helping me somehow change that? Watching those men bid on you like you were livestock reminded me why I had lost faith," Standing Bear said. "But seeing your courage, your refusal to accept what was being done to you, that reminded me that there are still people worth believing in." They sat in silence as darkness fell over the lake, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret realized that she was beginning to understand something important about the man who had saved her. He wasn't just helping her heal from her trauma, he was healing his own wounds through the act of protecting her. But that understanding brought with it a new worry. What would happen when her 5 years were up? When she was legally free to leave, would Standing Bear still need her presence to maintain his faith in humanity? And more troubling still, would she want to leave this place that was becoming more of a home than her father's ranch had ever been? The questions haunted her as she went to sleep that night, listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore and the distant call of loons. She had been saved from one fate, but what was the destiny that awaited her here in this place between worlds, with this man who walked the line between warrior and healer? Winter was coming to the territory, and with it would come new challenges and revelations. Margaret sensed that her real journey was just beginning, and that the woman who emerged from this experience would be very different from the frightened girl who had stood on that auction block only a week ago. As she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking not of the past and its pain, but of the future and its possibilities. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had a choice in what that future might hold, and the freedom to become whoever she was meant to be was perhaps the greatest gift Standing Bear had given her. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from Canada with fierce winds and temperatures that turned the lake into a sheet of ice seemingly overnight. Margaret had never experienced cold like this, the kind of cold that made your breath freeze in the air and turned water solid within minutes of being exposed. But inside the cabin, warmed by the great stone fireplace and the thick buffalo robes that Mary Crow Feather had taught her to prepare, she found a comfort she had never known at her father's ranch. The enforced closeness of winter brought changes to the household dynamic. With outdoor work limited to essential chores like feeding the animals and gathering firewood, the three of them spent long hours together in the main room of the cabin. Margaret discovered that Standing Bear was not only a skilled hunter and warrior, but also a gifted storyteller, with a repertoire of tribal legends that kept them entertained through the long, dark evenings. Mary Crow Feather proved to be a demanding but patient teacher in the women's crafts. Margaret learned to work with porcupine quills and glass beads, creating intricate patterns that told stories older than her people's presence on the continent. Her fingers grew skilled at tanning hides, weaving baskets from sweetgrass and willow, and preparing the traditional foods that would sustain them through the harsh months. But it was the conversations that truly transformed Margaret's understanding of the world. Sitting around the fire on endless winter nights, she heard Standing Bear and Mary Crow Feather discuss the history of their people with a perspective she had never encountered before. The stories she had grown up with, tales of savage Indians attacking innocent settlers, took on completely different meanings when told from the other side. "Your people came with promises of peace and trade," Standing Bear explained one evening, his voice thoughtful rather than bitter. "They said there was land enough for everyone, that we could live side by side as brothers. But peace, it seems, was never the real goal. Margaret found herself defending her own people at first, repeating the arguments she had heard all her life about civilization and progress. But as the weeks passed and she learned more about the systematic breaking of treaties, the deliberate spread of diseases, and the calculated destruction of the buffalo herds that sustained the Plains tribes, her certainty began to crumble. "I never knew," she said one night, her voice small as Standing Bear finished telling her about the Sand Creek Massacre, where Colonel Chivington's soldiers had slaughtered peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children, who were flying both American and white flags of peace. "We were told the Indians attacked first, that they were threatening the settlements." "History belongs to those who write it down," Mary Crowfeather observed quietly, not looking up from her beadwork. "Your people are very good at writing things down in ways that make them look righteous." The knowledge was painful, forcing Margaret to confront the possibility that everything she had been taught about her own people's nobility might be a lie. But it also opened her eyes to the courage and dignity of Standing Bear's people, who continued to fight not out of savage bloodlust, but out of desperate love for their children and their way of life. As winter deepened, Margaret began to notice changes in her relationship with Standing Bear. The formal politeness that had marked their early interactions gave way to something warmer and more complex. She caught him watching her, sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite read, and she found herself studying him in return, noticing the way firelight played across his strong features, the gentleness of his hands when he handled injured animals, the quiet authority in his voice when he spoke. The first crisis came in January, when a blizzard struck with such fury that it buried the cabin halfway up the windows. They were trapped inside for 3 days, and on the second day, Standing Bear developed a fever that left him delirious and weak. Margaret found herself taking charge, using the herbal knowledge Mary Crowfeather had taught her to prepare medicines and teas that would break the fever. She sat by his bedside for 2 days and nights, bathing his forehead with cool cloths and forcing bitter teas between his lips when he was lucid enough to drink. Mary Crowfeather helped, but she made it clear that she expected Margaret to take the lead in nursing him back to health. "He saved your life," the older woman said simply, when Margaret questioned whether she was qualified for such responsibility. "Now you save his." During Standing Bear's delirium, he spoke in Lakota, words that Margaret couldn't understand but that carried obvious pain and anguish. Mary Crowfeather translated some of it, revealing that he was reliving his sister's death, calling out warnings and apologies that came 3 years too late. "Winter moon," he whispered over and over, reaching for something only he could see. "I'm sorry, I should have protected you." Margaret found herself taking his reaching hand in both of hers, speaking softly to him in English, telling him that his sister was safe now, that he had done everything he could. She wasn't sure if he understood her words, but her voice seemed to calm him, and gradually his restless movements subsided. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd day, Standing Bear opened his eyes to find Margaret asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hands still holding his. He lay still for a long time, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the snow-covered windows. Her golden hair had grown longer during her time with them, and her skin had taken on a healthy glow from outdoor work and good food. But it was more than her physical appearance that held his attention. There was a strength in her face that hadn't been there when he first saw her on that auction block. A sense of purpose and belonging that transformed her from a frightened girl into a woman of substance. When Margaret finally stirred and saw that he was awake and clear-eyed, the relief on her face was so profound that it took Standing Bear's breath away. "Thank the spirits," she whispered, and he realized she had learned to invoke his people's beliefs as naturally as her own. "You stayed with me," he said, his voice rough from the fever. "Where else would I go?" Margaret replied, as if the question was absurd. "You needed help? I gave it. That's what people do for each other." Standing Bear studied her face, seeing in her eyes the same recognition that he felt stirring in his own heart. Something had changed between them during his illness. Some barrier had fallen away that could never be rebuilt. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued, teacher and student. They were something else now, something that carried both promise and danger. The rest of the winter passed in a different atmosphere. The easy camaraderie they had developed took on undertones of awareness and possibility that neither of them quite knew how to handle. Standing Bear found himself inventing reasons to touch Margaret's hand when passing her tools or food. Margaret discovered herself paying attention to the way his hair caught the firelight, the sound of his laughter when Mary Crowfeather told particularly outrageous stories about her youth. Mary Crowfeather watched these developments with the satisfied air of someone who had seen it coming from the beginning. She began making pointed comments about the benefits of marriage, the importance of strong grandchildren, and the foolishness of young people who couldn't recognize their own feelings. Her hints were so obvious that Margaret often found herself blushing, while Standing Bear would retreat into dignified silence that fooled no one. The situation came to a head one evening in late February when Standing Bear announced that he would be traveling to the trading post at Fort Peterson to sell furs and acquire supplies for spring. The journey would take several days, and both women would stay behind to tend the homestead. "I'll go with you," Margaret said immediately, surprising herself at the vehemence of her response. Standing Bear shook his head. "It's too dangerous. The weather is still unpredictable and there may be soldiers at the fort who wouldn't understand your presence with me." "I don't care about the danger," Margaret insisted, though she hadn't really considered the risks involved. "I'm tired of being protected all the time. I'm tired of being treated like I'm made of glass." "You don't understand the world beyond this valley," Standing Bear replied, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he considered a matter settled. "White soldiers have been known to shoot first and ask questions later when they see a white woman with Indians. I won't risk your life for the sake of your independence." The argument that followed was their first real disagreement, and it revealed depths of feeling that neither had fully acknowledged before. Margaret accused Standing Bear of treating her like property despite his claims of having freed her. Standing Bear countered that she was being foolishly naive about the dangers of their situation. Mary Crow Feather finally intervened, sending them both to bed like quarreling children. Margaret lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand the intensity of her emotions. Why did the thought of Standing Bear leaving fill her with such anxiety? Why did his refusal to let her accompany him feel like such a betrayal? She had been with him for 5 months now, and in that time, the small world of the Lake Valley had become more real to her than the life she had left behind. But there was more to it than that, and in the honest darkness of her room, Margaret finally admitted what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Standing Bear. Not the desperate, clinging love of a rescued victim, but the deep, complex love of a woman who had found her equal in strength and character. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Standing Bear left 3 days later, taking several pack horses loaded with furs and promising to return within a week. Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched him ride away with a sense of loss that seemed out of proportion to a temporary separation. When he disappeared over the hill, she felt as though part of herself had gone with him. "You love him," Mary Crow Feather observed matter-of-factly, finding Margaret still standing in the doorway an hour later. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret asked, not bothering to deny it. "Only to everyone with eyes," the older woman replied with dry humor. "The question is what you plan to do about it." Margaret came back into the cabin and sat heavily by the fire. "What can I do? I'm still legally bound to him for more than 4 years. Even if he feels the same way, how could we know if it's real or just gratitude and proximity?" Mary Crow Feather settled into her usual chair and picked up her beadwork. "You think too much like a white woman," she said. "Always worrying about what's proper and legal instead of what's true. In my people's way, a woman chooses her own husband and a man proves himself worthy of her choice. There are no papers involved, only the commitment 2 people make to each other and to the tribe." "But I'm not one of your people," Margaret pointed out. "I'm white. What would Standing Bear's people think if he married a white woman? What would mine think?" "Does it matter?" Mary Crow Feather asked simply. "Will you live your life for other people's opinions, or will you live it for your own heart?" The question haunted Margaret for the rest of the day and through the sleepless night that followed. She had never thought of herself as particularly brave, but the past months had shown her reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Perhaps it was time to show some of that courage in matters of the heart. Standing Bear returned 2 days ahead of schedule, arriving just as a late winter storm was building on the horizon. Margaret ran out to help him with the horses, her heart racing with relief and joy at seeing him safe. As he dismounted, their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze the same mixture of longing and uncertainty that she felt. "I missed you," she said simply, abandoning all pretense of casual friendship. Standing Bear went very still, studying her face as if trying to read her heart in her expression. "And I missed you," he replied quietly. "More than I should have. More than is wise." They stood there in the gathering wind, surrounded by pack horses and supplies, neither sure how to bridge the gap between admission and action. Finally, Margaret stepped closer. Close enough to reach out and touch his face if she chose. "Standing Bear," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "When my 5 years are up, when I'm legally free to make my own choices, would you want me to stay?" The hope that flared in his dark eyes gave her the answer before he spoke. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But only if you stay because you want to, not because you feel obligated or grateful." Margaret smiled, feeling a weight lift from her heart that she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Then I guess we have 4 more years to figure out if this is real or just 2 people finding comfort in isolation." Standing Bear reached up to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a snowflake that had landed there. "I think I already know," he said softly, "but 4 years will give us time to be sure." As they worked together to unload the supplies and settle the horses before the storm hit, Margaret felt a sense of completeness that she had never experienced before. She was no longer a victim being rescued, or a servant fulfilling an obligation. She was a woman making her own choices, building her own life with a man who saw her as an equal partner. The storm that night was fierce, but inside the warm cabin, the 3 of them sat around the fire, as Standing Bear shared news from the trading post in the outside world. Margaret listened to the talk of politics and tensions between whites and Indians, but for the first time, it felt like distant concerns rather than immediate threats. Her world had contracted to this valley, this cabin, this man who had saved her life and might yet claim her heart. The future was still uncertain, but it was a future she would help to shape rather than one that would be imposed upon her. And that, perhaps, was the greatest freedom of all. Spring came late to the Dakota Territory that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought changes that would test everything Margaret had learned about herself and her new life. The first visitors to the Lake Valley came in early April. 3 Lakota warriors on tired horses, their faces grim with news that made Standing Bear's expression darken with worry. Margaret watched from the cabin porch as Standing Bear spoke with the men in rapid Lakota, their voices carrying across the still air of morning. She had picked up enough of the language during the winter months to catch fragments of their conversation, words that spoke of soldiers, battles, and death. When the men finally rode away, Standing Bear remained standing by the lake's edge for a long time, staring across the water as if seeking answers in its depths.
"What did they want?" Margaret asked, when he finally returned to the cabin.
Standing Bear settled heavily into his chair by the fireplace, suddenly looking older than his 30 years. "The war between my people and the whites is escalating," he said quietly. "Crazy Horse and his warriors defeated Custer's cavalry at the Little Bighorn last summer, but the victory has only made the government more determined to force all tribes onto reservations." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "What does that mean for us, for this place?" "It means that our time of peace may be ending," Standing Bear replied, his voice heavy with resignation. The messengers were warning all scattered bands and individuals to either join the main body of the tribe or prepare for the consequences of remaining alone. Mary Crowfeather, who had been listening from her seat by the window, spoke for the first time since the visitors had left. "The young men want to fight," she said simply. "They see only the glory of battle and the shame of surrender. They do not understand that sometimes survival requires different kinds of courage." Over the following weeks, more visitors came to the valley. Some were Lakota seeking Standing Bear's counsel, others were white traders and settlers fleeing the increasing violence in the territory. Each group brought news that painted an increasingly desperate picture of the conflict engulfing the region. Margaret found herself caught between worlds in ways she had never fully appreciated before. When whites came to the valley seeking shelter or aid, she could see the suspicion and sometimes fear in their eyes when they realized she was living freely among Indians. When Lakota visitors arrived, some looked at her with open hostility, seeing her as a symbol of the enemy that was destroying their way of life. Standing Bear shielded her from the worst of these reactions, but Margaret could see the strain it placed on him. He was being forced to choose between the loyalty to his people that had defined his entire life and his growing feelings for a white woman who represented everything his tribe was fighting against. The crisis came in late May, when Standing Bear's cousin, Charging Bull, arrived at the valley with a war party of 12 young warriors. Margaret watched from the cabin as they rode down from the hills, their faces painted for battle, their weapons ready. She had never seen Standing Bear look so torn as he did when he recognized his cousin's war cry echoing across the lake. The confrontation that followed was conducted entirely in Lakota, but the passion and anger in the voices made translation unnecessary. Charging Bull gestured repeatedly toward the cabin where Margaret waited, his voice rising with indignation. Standing Bear's responses were calmer but no less intense, and Margaret could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of his cousin's accusations. Mary Crowfeather translated quietly for Margaret's benefit, her weathered face troubled. Charging Bull says Standing Bear has forgotten his duty to his people. He says no true Lakota warrior would choose a white woman over the blood of his ancestors. Margaret felt sick as she listened to the increasingly heated exchange. She had known this moment might come, but knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. She was watching the man she loved being forced to choose between her and his entire heritage. And the terrible thing was that she wasn't sure which choice she wanted him to make. Standing Bear's response to his cousin was long and passionate, his voice carrying clearly across the water. When he finished, several of the young warriors looked uncertain, but Charging Bull's expression remained hostile. "What did he say?" Margaret asked. Mary Crow Feather was quiet for a moment, her eyes soft with pride and sorrow. "He said that honor is not determined by the color of a person's skin, but by the content of their character. He said that you have proven yourself worthy of respect through your courage and your willingness to learn our ways. He said that if his people cannot see beyond the accident of your birth to recognize your worth as a human being, then perhaps they are not the people he thought he knew." The words should have filled Margaret with joy, but instead they made her heart ache. She could see what Standing Bear's defense of her was costing him. The pain of separation from his own people. The burden of being seen as a traitor to everything he had once held sacred. Charging Bull's final words were delivered with the finality of a death sentence. Mary Crow Feather translated reluctantly, "He says Standing Bear must choose. Come with them to join Sitting Bull's band and fight the whites, or be considered an enemy of the Lakota people." Standing Bear's response was immediate and unwavering. "I choose to stay." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret watched as Charging Bull's face went through a series of emotions, disappointment, anger, and finally a cold hardness that chilled her to the bone. When he spoke again, his words were clipped and formal. "He has disowned Standing Bear," Mary Crow Feather whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "He says Standing Bear is no longer his cousin, no longer Lakota. He says they will not return to this valley, and if they meet Standing Bear on the battlefield, they will treat him as they would any other enemy." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the war party ride away without looking back. Standing Bear remained by the lake's edge until they disappeared over the hills, his broad shoulders set with determination, but his head bowed with grief. When he finally returned to the cabin, Margaret met him at the door. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching for his hands. "I'm so sorry this is happening because of me." Standing Bear pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't take responsibility for other people's inability to see beyond their own hatred and fear. I made my choice with open eyes, knowing the cost. But your family, your people, you are my people now," Standing Bear said firmly, pulling back to look into her eyes. "You and Mary Crow Feather, and anyone else who believes that love and respect matter more than the color of skin or the circumstances of birth." Mary Crow Feather, who had been watching from her chair, spoke up with dry humor. "Well, if you two are going to be sentimental about it, perhaps you should make it official. I'm getting too old to live with unmarried people carrying on under my roof." Margaret felt herself blushing, but Standing Bear smiled for the first time since his cousin's arrival. "Is that a proposal, grandmother?" "That's a suggestion that you stop dancing around your feelings like nervous children," Mary Crow Feather replied tartly. "The girl has already proven herself worthy, and you've already sacrificed everything for her. Might as well get the benefits of marriage, along with the burdens." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Standing Bear took Margaret's hands in his and spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "Margaret Whitmore," he said formally, "I offer you my heart, my protection, and my loyalty for all the days of my life. Will you accept me as your husband according to the customs of my people?" Margaret looked into his dark eyes, seeing not just love but also the strength and honor that had first saved her life and then transformed it. "I accept," she whispered. "And I offer you the same, my heart, my loyalty, and my love for as long as we both shall live." Mary Crow Feather smiled with satisfaction and began preparations for a traditional Lakota marriage ceremony. Over the next 3 days, she taught Margaret the rituals and meanings behind each element of the wedding, helping her create the beaded dress she would wear, and preparing the feast that would celebrate their union. Standing Bear, meanwhile, disappeared for long hours into the hills, returning with the gifts he would present to his bride: a magnificent horse trained to respond to her voice alone, a rifle for her protection, and a necklace of silver and turquoise that had belonged to his grandmother. The ceremony itself was held at sunrise on a hill overlooking the lake, with only Mary Crow Feather present as witness. Margaret wore her beaded dress with pride, feeling the weight of its cultural significance even as she embraced her new identity as a Lakota wife. Standing Bear had painted his face with traditional symbols and wore the finest clothes his people knew how to make. They exchanged vows in both English and Lakota, promising to honor each other's heritage while building something new together. When Standing Bear placed the necklace around Margaret's neck, she felt the last ties to her old life finally fall away. She was no longer Margaret Whitmore, the rancher's daughter sold at auction. She was now Margaret Standing Bear, a Lakota woman who had chosen her path with open eyes and a willing heart. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, with Mary Crow Feather telling stories of other marriages between different peoples, all of them testament to the power of love to overcome even the deepest divisions. As the day wore on, Margaret felt a peace settle into her soul that she had never experienced before. She belonged somewhere now, not because she had been placed there by circumstance, but because she had chosen it. That night, as she lay in Standing Bear's arms, as his wife for the first time, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had stood on an auction block, her future being decided by men who saw her as property. Now she was a married woman who had chosen her own destiny, partner to a man who respected her strength and honored her choices. But even in her happiness, Margaret knew that their struggles were far from over. The conflict between whites and Indians was escalating, and their isolated valley would not remain untouched forever. They would need all the strength their love could give them to survive what was coming. Outside their window, the lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Margaret listened to the wild sound and felt it echo in her own heart. She too had found her mate, and together they would face whatever storms lay ahead. The future was uncertain, filled with dangers they could barely imagine, but Margaret no longer faced it alone, and that made all the difference. She had learned that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, and that the courage to love across lines of hatred and fear might be the most powerful force in the world. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last thought was a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided Standing Bear to that auction block on a morning that now seemed like a lifetime ago. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the mere transaction of freedom for gold. They had found in each other the possibility of becoming who they were truly meant to be. The summer of 1877 brought with it a tension that seemed to hang over the entire Dakota Territory like storm clouds that never broke. Margaret, now 6 months into her marriage to Standing Bear, had learned to read the signs of approaching trouble in ways her former life had never required. The absence of normal trade visitors, the strange behavior of wildlife, and the occasional column of smoke on distant horizons all spoke of a land torn apart by war. In July, the inevitable finally happened. Margaret was tending the garden in the early morning when she heard the sound of many horses approaching from the east. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her blood turn to ice water when she saw the blue uniforms and glinting weapons of a cavalry patrol. Standing Bear emerged from the barn where he had been working with the horses, his face calm but alert as he assessed the approaching soldiers. "Go into the cabin," he told Margaret quietly, but she shook her head. "We face this together," she said, moving to stand beside him. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The patrol was led by a young lieutenant, whose pristine uniform and nervous eyes marked him as someone new to frontier duty. Behind him rode 20 soldiers, their faces hard with the wariness of men who had seen too much violence. Margaret noticed that several of them had their hands resting casually on their weapons, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. The lieutenant dismounted and approached Standing Bear with the careful movements of someone trying to appear confident while fighting his own fear. "Are you the Indian called Standing Bear?" he asked, his voice pitched higher than he probably intended. "I am," Standing Bear replied calmly, making no move that could be interpreted as threatening. The lieutenant glanced nervously at Margaret, clearly confused by the presence of a white woman who was obviously not a captive. "I am Lieutenant Carson, United States Cavalry. I have orders to inform all Indians in this territory that they must report to the Pine Ridge Agency within 30 days for relocation to the reservation." Standing Bear's expression didn't change, but Margaret could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. "And if we choose not to comply?" Carson's face flushed red. "Then you will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." He paused, clearly struggling with his next words. "Sir, I have to ask about the white woman. If she's being held against her will—" "I am Margaret Standing Bear," Margaret interrupted, stepping forward with her chin raised. "I am this man's wife, and I am here by my own choice." The lieutenant's confusion was almost comical. "But ma'am, you can't possibly—" That is, the law doesn't recognize marriages between whites and Indians. Then the law is wrong, Margaret said flatly. I am exactly where I choose to be, Lieutenant Carson. Carson looked helplessly between Margaret and Standing Bear, clearly out of his depth. Ma'am, I have orders to offer safe passage to any white captives. I am not a captive, Margaret said firmly. I am a free woman living with her husband. If that's difficult for you to understand, perhaps you should examine your own assumptions about what freedom looks like. Standing Bear placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to dealing with confused officials. Lieutenant, my wife and I understand your orders. We also understand the consequences of refusing to comply. But we will not be leaving this valley. Carson's hand moved instinctively towards his sidearm, and Margaret saw several of his soldiers tense in response. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and she realized that they were seconds away from violence that would destroy everything they had built. Before anyone could act, however, a new voice cut through the tension. Stand down, Lieutenant. Everyone turned to see an older man in a colonel's uniform riding into the clearing, his weathered face bearing the marks of long service on the frontier. Margaret recognized him immediately. Colonel John Mackenzie, whose reputation for both military skill and unusual fairness in dealing with Indians was known throughout the territory. Colonel Mackenzie, Carson stammered, clearly relieved to have a superior officer take charge of the situation. Sir, I was just informing these people of the relocation order. Mackenzie dismounted and studied Standing Bear with the assessing gaze of a professional soldier. You're Standing Bear, he said, and it wasn't a question. I've heard of you. You're the one who's been helping wounded soldiers get back to their own lines, regardless of which side they were fighting for. Standing Bear inclined his head slightly. I help anyone who needs help, Colonel, Indian or white. So I've heard, Mackenzie replied. You've also managed to stay out of the fighting while your cousins have been raising hell all over the territory. His gaze shifted to Margaret, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. Mrs. Standing Bear, I presume? I heard about your situation last year. Quite a story. Margaret wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not, but she met his gaze steadily. If you've heard the story, then you know why I'm here, Colonel. Mackenzie nodded slowly. I do indeed. He turned back to Standing Bear, his expression thoughtful. You present an interesting problem, my friend. Technically, you're subject to the relocation order, but you're also not exactly hostile, and you've provided aid to my soldiers. That complicates things. We don't want trouble, Colonel. Standing Bear said quietly. We want only to live in peace in this valley, and I'd like nothing better than to let you do exactly that, Mackenzie replied. But I have orders, and I have politicians breathing down my neck who don't understand the difference between hostile Indians and peaceful ones. The silence that followed stretched taut with possibility and danger. Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for Mackenzie to decide their fate. Finally, the colonel spoke again, his words careful and deliberate. Lieutenant Carson, you will note in your report that you delivered the relocation order as directed, and that the subjects stated they would consider their options. He fixed Carson with a steady stare. You will also note that no hostile activity was observed, and that the subjects appeared to be living peacefully, without threatening any settlers or travelers. Carson looked confused, but nodded. Yes, sir. But the 30-day deadline will be noted in your report, Mackenzie said firmly. Now prepare the men to move out. We have other areas to patrol. As the soldiers began to mount up, Mackenzie approached Standing Bear and Margaret privately. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. I can give you time, but I can't give you forever. There are forces in Washington that want all Indians on reservations, and they don't care about individual circumstances. You need to understand that. Standing Bear nodded gravely. What are you suggesting, Colonel? Mackenzie glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. I'm suggesting that if you were to disappear from this valley for a while, say until the political situation calms down, it might be easier for everyone involved to forget exactly where you were supposed to be. Margaret felt her heart sink. You're telling us to run. I'm telling you to survive, Mackenzie replied bluntly. Because if you stay here, eventually someone will come who won't be as reasonable as I am. Someone who'll see an Indian off the reservation and a white woman living with him and decide to solve the problem with bullets. After the patrol left, Margaret and Standing Bear sat by the lake with Mary Crowfeather, discussing their limited options. They could comply with the relocation order and go to Pine Ridge, where they would be separated, and Margaret would likely be sent back to white society. They could resist and fight, which would mean certain death. Or they could follow Mackenzie's suggestion and disappear, abandoning everything they had built together. There is another choice, Mary Crowfeather said quietly as the sun set over the water. My people have always known that sometimes survival requires letting go of one thing to preserve something more important. She went on to explain that her late husband's family had relatives among the Crow tribe in Montana Territory, people who had maintained better relations with the government and might offer sanctuary. It would mean leaving the Lake Valley forever, starting over in a strange place among people who might not accept them. But it would also mean staying together and staying alive. That night, Margaret and Standing Bear lay awake discussing their future. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. They had already lost Standing Bear's family and much of their connection to Lakota society. What mattered now was preserving what they had found together. We'll go to Montana, Margaret said finally. We'll start over if we have to, but we stay together. Standing Bear pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. Are you sure? It means leaving everything familiar, living as strangers among people who may not welcome us. You are my home, Margaret replied simply. Everything else is just geography. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for a journey that would take them far from everything they knew. Mary Crowfeather surprised them both by announcing her intention to come with them, claiming that she was too old to learn new ways of living and preferred to face the unknown with people she cared about. On their last morning in the valley, Margaret stood on the hill where they had been married, looking down at the lake that had become such an important part of her story. Standing Bear joined her, and together they said goodbye to the place where they had learned to love each other and discovered who they were meant to be. Do you regret it? Standing Bear asked as they prepared to mount their horses. Everything you gave up to be here with me. Margaret looked at him, this man who had saved her from a fate worse than death, who had shown her that love could transcend every barrier humans created, who had chosen her over everything else in his world, and smiled. The only thing I regret, she said, is that it took an auction block for us to find each other. As they rode west toward an uncertain future, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a frightened girl with no choices and no hope. Now she was a woman who had learned to fight for what mattered, to love without reservation, and to face the future with courage rather than fear. Behind them lay the ruins of two worlds, the white society that had been willing to sell her as property, and the Indian nation that had rejected Standing Bear for choosing love over loyalty to racial hatred. Ahead lay the possibility of building something new, something that honored the best of both their backgrounds while creating space for the family they hoped to become. The trail was long and uncertain, but they traveled it together, and in the end, Margaret thought as she felt Standing Bear's strong presence beside her, that was all that really mattered. They had found each other across a divide that was supposed to be uncrossable, and they had chosen to keep choosing each other every day since. That was a foundation strong enough to build any kind of future on. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman telling stories to her grandchildren in the Montana Territory, she would always end the tale of how she met their grandfather the same way. Remember, children, that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the chance to choose your own destiny. Your grandfather gave me that gift when he bid for my freedom, but the real gift was learning that I had the courage to choose love over safety, hope over fear, and the unknown over the familiar. The story of the rancher's daughter and the Lakota warrior became legend in the territory. A tale told around campfires and kitchen tables about the power of love to overcome hatred, the courage required to choose your own path, and the truth that home is not a place but the people who see you, truly see you, and choose to love what they find. And if the ending wasn't quite what anyone expected when it began on that dusty auction block, it was exactly the ending it was supposed to be. A testament to the idea that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger willing to risk everything to do what's right, and that the courage to love across impossible divides might be the most powerful force in the world.